In the dense jungles of Peleliu, 1944, the Japanese soldiers were certain of one thing: flamethrowers were useless. The island's coral caves and concrete bunkers, they believed, made them untouchable. They laughed at the idea that a stream of fire could dig them out of their fortress. But they had never seen American Marines fight in the dark. As the sun fell over Peleliu, the jungle began to breathe smoke. The Marines moved silently between twisted palms, carrying tanks of pressurized fuel on their backs. The M2 flamethrower, heavy, clumsy, and deadly. Each man who carried one knew what it meant. If he was hit, he'd die in fire. But they went anyway. When the first jets of flame roared into the caves, the laughter stopped. The fire crawled into tunnels, through cracks, and around corners, devouring everything it touched. The night sky glowed red as the island itself seemed to burn. For hours, the flames didn't fade. They danced, they hunted, and by morning, the bunkers that had mocked the fire were nothing but molten silence. The Japanese had been right about one thing: flamethrowers were useless, until Peleliu burned all night. Before the battle, the Japanese called Peleliu the island that could not burn. It was small, barely 6 miles long, but made of coral so dense that artillery shells shattered against it. Its ridges were honeycombed with tunnels, caves, and bunkers reinforced with steel and limestone. To them, it was perfect, a natural fortress carved by time and war. For months, they prepared it. Engineers dug into the cliffs, building gun positions invisible from the air. Mortar pits were camouflaged under palm leaves. Machine gun nests hid behind coral ridges. They could vanish into the rock and reappear anywhere. "Let the Americans come," their commander said. "They cannot burn stone." In September 1944, the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu under a burning sun. The temperature on the beaches reached 115 degrees. Within minutes, the first wave was pinned down by machine gun fire. The sand turned red. The Marines realized what they were up against: an enemy buried in the earth itself. Days passed. Artillery couldn't reach the tunnels. Grenades vanished into caves without sound. Every ridge had to be taken by hand, every hole by death. The Marines fought for yards, not miles. "You don't fight men here," one Marine wrote. "You fight shadows in the rock." Then came the flamethrower teams. The weapon was brutal and primitive. A steel tank filled with gasoline and napalm, strapped to a man's back, connected to a long nozzle. It could spit fire up to 40 yards, but the man carrying it was a walking bomb. If a bullet hit his tank, he would ignite instantly. The Japanese laughed when they first saw it. They believed the caves would protect them. "The fire will hit the stone," one officer said. "Then it will die." They were wrong, because the Americans weren't fighting a traditional war anymore. They weren't advancing across open ground, they were digging out ghosts. The flamethrower became the only weapon that could reach into the heart of Peleliu. Each team worked in pairs, one carrying the tank, the other covering with a rifle. They crawled under fire, climbed coral ridges with bare hands, and crept to within 10 yards of enemy caves. Then, with a deep breath, they pulled the trigger. The sound was unlike anything else in war, a roar like a dragon's breath, followed by a wave of heat so strong it melted the very air. The fire clung to everything: walls, ceilings, even the wind. It didn't just burn, it consumed. Inside the tunnels, the Japanese learned that their stone walls had betrayed them. The flames rolled along the ceilings, sucking the oxygen away. The caves became ovens. The coral glowed red. The fire didn't stop at the entrance, it crawled deeper, finding air pockets, licking through cracks, devouring everything alive. By nightfall, the hills above the landing beaches glowed faintly orange. Marines watched from below as smoke poured from dozens of cave mouths. "The island's on fire," one whispered. Another replied, "No, the island is fire." The Japanese defenders still believed they could hold. They thought the fire would pass. But what they didn't understand was that the Americans weren't trying to burn the island. They were trying to erase the idea that it couldn't be burned. And before the night was over, Peleliu itself would prove them wrong. The first cave looked harmless, just a dark slit in a wall of coral, half hidden by ferns and shattered palm fronds. The Marines had seen a dozen like it already. Each one was a throat with teeth. Corporal Eddie Marlowe crouched behind a chunk of limestone, his shoulders bowed under the twin tanks of the M2 flamethrower. The straps bit into his collarbones. Sweat ran down his back like rain inside a furnace. His nozzle man, Phelps, lay beside him, eyes fixed on the cave mouth through iron sights. "You ready?" Phelps whispered. Marlowe nodded, even though no one was ever ready. He checked the pressure gauge with trembling fingers, then glanced at the ridge above. Machine gun fire stitched the sky with sparks as Japanese tracers whined over the beachhead far below. The whole island seemed to vibrate a hot anvil hammered by artillery. "Go!" the squad leader shouted. Marlowe moved. 10 yards of broken coral, 10 yards of silence. He could feel the island breathing heat rising from the stone, the smell of cordite and salt trapped in the air. At 7 yards, movement flashed inside. A grenade rolled out, clinking like a bell. Phelps kicked it and dove. The blast lifted dust and pebbles into their faces. Marlowe planted his boots, raised the wand, and squeezed the trigger. The nozzle coughed, then roared. A river of fire tore into the darkness, bright as noon. Flames sheeted along the cave roof, licked the walls, bellowed deeper as if the tunnel itself had inhaled. The heat slapped him like a door slamming. He held the stream for 3 seconds, 4 then released. Smoke belched out in a black rush. From deeper inside, something screamed. "Again!" Phelps yelled. Marlowe fired a second burst, this time at an upward angle. The jet curled at the ceiling and rolled back the dragon's tongue the instructors had promised. When he released the trigger, the cave answered with silence. The squad edged forward behind a shield of rifles. A Marine tossed a phosphorus grenade into the entrance. When the white smoke cleared, they saw what the fire had done. Black walls, molten rivulets hardened into glassy streaks, rifles melted to rock. The Japanese had believed coral could not burn. They were wrong. Stone doesn't burn, but tunnels cook. They moved ridge to ridge, cave to cave, repeating the ritual. Crawl, breathe, ignite. The flamethrower teams were the point of the spear, followed by demolition satchel charges to collapse the dead mouths so they stayed dead. The island fought like a living thing, each cave a nerve you had to sever twice. By afternoon, the air turned syrup-thick. Smoke drifted low in grey sheets that tasted of metal and oil. The sun hammered the ridgeline, and the ridgeline hammered back with heat stored inside the coral. Phelps tore a canteen open with his teeth and poured water over Marlowe's head. Steam rose off his hair. "You're cooking, Eddie," he said. "We all are," Marlowe answered. They pushed toward a ridge the maps called Bloody Nose. The Japanese had carved it into a beehive, interlocking caves, murder slits, tunnels that let a machine gun vanish and reappear 2 positions away. Earlier assaults had been thrown back, bodies left where they fell because there was no safe way to pull them out. This time, the Marines changed the law of the island. They came with flamethrowers up front, engineers behind them carrying Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges, riflemen on the flanks to cut down anything that tried to bolt. A platoon sergeant traced the plan into dust with a bayonet. "We burn it here, here, and here. They'll run to these vents. We close them with charges. We don't take the ridge, we deny it oxygen." The first approach nearly killed them. A hidden knee mortar thunked. A shell burst on the slope and showered them with coral shards. Marlowe felt something hot slice his cheek. He wiped blood and grit away with the back of his glove, lifted the wand, and crawled again. A machine gun opened from their right. Phelps fired back in disciplined bursts too. Pause. 2, walking the sights toward the flash. The gun fell silent. They reached the first vent, a ragged hole at shin height, breathing cool air from a belly of tunnels below. Marlowe aimed low and let the fire fall into it like liquid. The jet vanished around a bend. The vent exhaled smoke that smelled sweet and wrong. The squad leader counted off seconds, then waved the engineers forward. A satchel charge slid into the hole and thumped the earth shut. On the other side of the ridge, Japanese defenders blinked in sudden darkness and heat. They had been told fire couldn't reach them. Now it moved along the ceiling like a living thing, drawing breath, stealing breath. The coral that had felt like ice all summer now felt like a stove. They tried to backtrack through a tunnel and found it was already hungry with flame. Above, the Marines repeated the pattern. Fire to drive them, charges to trap them. A map of heat across a fortress that thought it could not burn. Near dusk, when the sky went the color of ash, the island changed color too. Caves breathed orange. The tops of ridges glowed at the seams like iron cooling in a forge. Marines on the lower slopes looked up and went quiet. "The whole hill's on fire," someone said. "No," the sergeant answered. "The hill's full of fire. At a cave mouth near the crest, a Japanese officer leaned into the smoke and shouted orders that vanished in the roar. A figure stumbled from the heat, uniform smoking, then ducked back inside. He had one last image of the enemy, an American crouched at the lip of the cave, face streaked black, eyes like flint, holding a dragon by a steel throat. The flame roared again, and the image ended. Marlowe's tanks ran dry just as the stars came out cold lights over a hot world. He could feel the emptiness in the straps, the sudden lightness that meant he wasn't a walking bomb anymore. Phelps clapped his shoulder. "Swap out. 2 minutes." A runner arrived with fresh tanks, breathless, grinning, saying the words every man needed. "You're doing it." The lines moving. They refueled in the lee of a boulder, while corpsmen taped gauze to burned hands and passed salt tablets like communion. Far below, the surf whispered like it couldn't believe what the island had become. A radio crackled. Other companies were reporting the same glow, the same collapses, the same sudden silences where enemy guns had been. When they went up again, the ridge sounded different. Less gunfire, more crackle. 1,000 tiny fires talking to each other in the coral's language: pop, hiss, sigh. Marlowe crept to a vent no bigger than his forearm and felt heat on his face from a room he could not see. He pictured maps of tunnels like veins, and himself as a surgeon with fire for blood. They found a wider entrance where trees had been blasted into char. Phelps lobbed a grenade. The blast echoed down tunnels like a storm in a pipe organ. Marlowe gave the cave a long, patient burn, counting to 5, to 8, to 10, while the tanks on his back gurgled. He let off and listened. At first, nothing. Then a sound he had learned to trust. The cave, breathing out. "Now," the sergeant said. The engineers slid a charge into the mouth, backed off, and flattened themselves to the stone. The detonation folded the entrance like paper. Dust billowed. The ridge shuddered and settled. On the far side of the island, Japanese officers scribbled reports by lamplight, hands shaking. Flame enters from small holes, tunnels unusable, positions permanently lost. One wrote a line he never meant anyone to read: "Fire defeated stone." By midnight, the horizon pulsed a heartbeat of orange behind black sawteeth of palm trunks. The sky had no stars above Peleliu. The island made its own. Marines lay with their helmets over their faces, too tired to talk, the hot stone radiating into their bones. The smell of gasoline clung to everything. In dreams that weren't dreams, they heard the sound of the nozzles roar and the sigh of caves giving up. Marlowe sat with his back to a boulder, hands blistered, tanks empty again. Phelps handed him a cigarette and lit it with a shaking match. They smoked in silence. "Think they still think it's useless?" Phelps asked finally. Marlowe watched the ridge exhale another thin ribbon of flame. "Not after tonight," he said. "Nothing on this island is useless after tonight." Somewhere to their left, a cave belched a last exhale, then went dark forever. On their right, a new jet of fire stitched the night, and men cheered without lifting their heads. The island that could not burn was learning a new verb, and the Marines learned something too. You could burn a fortress if you were willing to carry the fire on your back. By midnight, Peleliu had turned into a volcano that breathed. From the beaches, Marines could see the hills flickering like the pulse of some dying god. The sky glowed dull red, smoke rolling across the sea, mixing with salt spray. Even the ocean looked on fire. The sound never stopped. The island hissed, crackled, coughed a low thunder that never left the ears. Somewhere up the slope, men shouted, the bursts of flamethrowers flashing like lightning inside the haze. The flame wasn't bright anymore. It was a steady, hungry glow. At the foot of Bloody Nose Ridge, Sergeant Tom Keller's platoon crouched in a bowl of shattered stone. They were waiting for the signal to move up, faces streaked with soot and oil. The air was thick enough to chew. "Feels like the devil's kitchen," someone muttered. Keller grinned tiredly. "Then let's finish cooking." Above them, Corporal Eddie Marlowe and Phelps were still climbing. The tanks on their backs sloshed with what fuel remained, gasoline thickened with napalm, heavy as guilt. Each step up, the coral slope felt like walking through the breath of a furnace. The caves ahead spat the occasional burst of gunfire, but the pattern was fading. The Japanese had stopped fighting in formations. They fought now as ghosts, one rifle at a time, flashes of defiance swallowed by the heat. Inside the caves, it was worse. Japanese soldiers crawled through tunnels that had turned into ovens, their uniforms smouldering, air turning to steam. Some tried to dig upward, others deeper. The coral betrayed them, splitting, cracking, glowing faintly from within. They had built their fortress inside the earth. Now the earth itself had turned against them. From one cave, a young officer named Saito staggered into the open, eyes wide and glassy. Behind him, the tunnel roared like a dragon's throat. He collapsed to his knees, staring at the flames curling out of the stone. "We built this to last 1,000 years," he whispered, voice broken. 1,000. The fire took his last word. Back on the ridge, the Marines moved methodically, one cave at a time. No rush, no mercy. Flamethrower bursts were shorter now, more precise. Each one was followed by the muffled thump of a demolition charge, the brief scream of air sucked from a sealed tunnel, and then quiet. The rhythm of fire and silence became hypnotic, almost ritualistic. Marlowe paused to swap tanks for the 4th time that night. His gloves smoked when he touched the metal straps. Phelps handed him the wrench and joked, "You know, if we ever get home, you're never lighting a barbecue again." Marlowe smiled through cracked lips. "Not unless the stakes are shooting back." They laughed, just for a second, a short, dry laugh that sounded human in a place that had forgotten what humanity was. Then they got up and kept moving. Down below, the regimental command post was lit only by maps glowing red in lamplight. Radio operators called in reports. Cave Complex 22 neutralized. Ridge east side secured. A colonel drew a finger across the map, connecting the dots. "They said this island couldn't be burned," he murmured. "Tell them it's still burning." The night wind shifted, carrying the smell of scorched coral and diesel. It smelled like the end of something ancient. At 2 a.m., the Marines reached the heart of the ridge, a cluster of caves big enough to hold a company. They could hear voices inside, faint, desperate, echoing through stone. The Japanese refused to surrender. "We die in the fire we built," one shouted in Japanese, his voice cracking. The Marines didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Marlowe stepped forward, nodded once to Phelps, and opened the nozzle. The stream of fire shot in and curved upward, painting the walls red. The roar drowned out everything, shouts, wind, even thought. The cave glowed like molten glass, the smoke pouring out in a slow, steady river. A demolition man ran up, set a charge by the entrance, and backed off. The explosion folded the mouth inward with a dull crash. The island trembled. When the dust cleared, the glow from inside the cave didn't stop. The coral itself was burning. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the sergeant who'd seen everything looked stunned. "Christ," he whispered. "The rock's on fire." It wasn't literally burning, it was radiant, heated to orange by the trapped napalm. The effect was otherworldly. Ridges shining like lanterns in the night, the air shimmering with heat. To men who had fought through every nightmare since Guadalcanal, it felt like something new. The Japanese who survived deeper in the tunnels could see it too. The walls glowed around them. Some tried to pray, but the oxygen was gone. Others wrote letters that would never be sent. One officer, unable to bear the heat, drew his sword and whispered, "Better to vanish in honor than melt in shame." The flame answered him. By dawn, Peleliu was a silhouette of smoke. The jungle was gone, the coral blackened and streaked with ash. Marines stumbled through the haze like men walking through another planet. They passed caves still breathing thin ribbons of smoke, the smell of fuel heavy in the air. Someone said quietly, "It burned all night." Marlowe nodded. His face was grey with soot, eyes red. "Yeah," he said softly, "and it's still burning." When the sun finally rose, it had to fight its way through the haze, a pale disk over a field of smouldering stone. The battle wasn't over, but the island's soul had changed. Peleliu, the fortress of coral, had learned fire. And in that moment, even the Japanese who still held their positions knew the truth. The Americans hadn't just brought weapons, they had brought something elemental. The island had been built to resist, but fire doesn't respect walls. It flows, it climbs, it consumes, and once it begins, it doesn't stop. By the time the sun rose over Peleliu, the island looked like another planet. The jungle that had once swayed with green life was gone, replaced by twisted shadows and blackened stumps. The coral ridges, once pale white, now shimmered a dull red. Like the inside of a dying forge, smoke rose in slow, lazy coils, carrying with it the bitter scent of burnt oil and stone. The Marines were ghosts now, faces smeared with ash, uniforms stiff with soot and salt. Their eyes were bloodshot, their lips cracked, their throats raw from smoke. Yet they moved with quiet purpose, because the fire had changed something inside them. No one spoke much that morning. The island itself made enough noise, the faint hiss of cooling rock, the drip of molten coral, the soft collapse of tunnels still burning from within. Every now and then, a cave would exhale a plume of black smoke, as if sighing out its last breath. Corporal Eddie Marlowe sat on a ledge near the ridge, his flamethrower tanks empty, the straps cutting into his shoulders. He'd used 5 sets of tanks through the night. Now he just stared at the horizon, where the ocean met the smoke. "You ever think the island could die?" he asked quietly. Phelps looked over, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "I think it did," he said. "We just watched it happen." Below them, stretcher teams carried the wounded down to the beaches, men half-conscious, faces grey from heat exhaustion. Some had burns on their arms and necks, not from enemy fire, but from their own weapons. The flamethrower didn't forgive mistakes. It made heroes of the steady and ashes of the careless. A radio crackled nearby. The voice of a Marine captain came through, hoarse but calm. "Ridge secured. Repeat, ridge secured. Secondary cave systems neutralized." In plain language, Peleliu's back was broken. But victory didn't look like glory. It looked like ruin. The surviving Japanese, the few who hadn't burned or suffocated, emerged in small groups over the next days. Dazed, starving, their uniforms fused to their skin. They carried no weapons, only rags of white cloth tied to sticks. One of them, a young private no older than 20, knelt before a Marine squad and whispered in broken English, "We thought you could not reach us." The Marine who accepted his surrender just nodded. Neither did we. When the last cave was cleared, the engineers detonated the entrances to seal them forever. The explosions rolled through the island like distant thunder, shaking loose clouds of ash. For a moment, it looked like Peleliu was breathing again, not in fire, but in dust. At night, when the wind shifted, the smell of burned coral drifted out to sea. Navy sailors aboard offshore ships said they could still see the glow from miles away. One lieutenant wrote in his journal, "The island still burns. It is as if the earth itself is trying to forget what it saw." Back at the ridge, Marlowe stood watching the flames flicker inside the sealed caves. He didn't feel pride or victory, only awe. It wasn't the fire that scared them, he said to Phelps. It was what came after. The silence. Phelps nodded. "You can put out fire. You can't put out silence." The island stayed hot for days. Rain fell, turning to steam as it hit the ground. The Marines built makeshift shelters in the shadow of burnt trees, sleeping on ground that still radiated heat. Some nights they swore they could hear popping sounds from the sealed tunnels, the last echoes of trapped fuel or shifting coral. Others believed it was something else, the island's memory, refusing to fade. Reporters arrived weeks later, long after the fire had died. They walked through the ridges with cameras, taking pictures of what was left. Melted helmets, blackened rifles, scorched caves that looked like the mouths of monsters. One journalist called it a landscape painted by fire, but no photograph could capture the smell, or the heat, or the sound of flame crawling through stone. Only those who had been there knew how alive the fire had felt, how it had moved with a will of its own. When word reached Japan, commanders were stunned. Their fortress of coral, their unburnable island, had fallen in less than 2 weeks. They didn't understand how. One general reportedly said, "The Americans do not fight the way we expect. They fight the elements themselves." Peleliu became a warning, whispered across the Pacific, that the Americans had learned to wield fire as a weapon of precision, not chaos. It wasn't the size of their bombs or the number of their guns. It was their persistence, their refusal to stop burning until resistance itself turned to ash. For the Marines, Peleliu became something else, a scar that never healed. When the war ended, few spoke of it. Those who did said the same thing. It wasn't the blood that haunted them. It was the light, the way the caves glowed from within, the way the fire seemed to breathe, the way the island burned all night and the world watched a myth melt into reality. And in that moment, one lesson was carved into history itself. You can build your walls from steel, your fortresses from stone, and your pride from certainty. But when the fire comes, Nothing is truly unburnable. When the last shots faded and the air turned still, the fire didn't die, it simply sank into the stone. Peleliu had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a memory made of heat. The Marines moved carefully across the ridges, their boots crunching through layers of ash and coral dust. There were no birds, no insects, not even wind, only a low hiss from cracks in the rock where fire still breathed like something sleeping beneath the surface. The island that had roared all night now whispered. Corporal Eddie Marlowe walked with his flamethrower slung empty, its tanks dented and blackened. He didn't reload. There was nothing left to burn. Around him, the shapes of melted helmets and rifles littered the slopes like fossils of a vanished species. The air shimmered with heat that refused to leave, like the island itself was remembering what it had been. He paused near a sealed cave. The explosion that closed it had left a perfect ring of glass around the entrance coral melted into crystal by the fire's touch. Through it, he could see faint reflections of himself and the men behind him, faces ghosted in the glass. He wondered if the ones inside were watching back. Phelps stopped beside him, adjusting the strap on his rifle. "Feels wrong, walking on it," he muttered. Marlowe nodded. "We made the ground here." Neither of them smiled. A chaplain arrived, his uniform streaked with soot. He knelt near the cave mouth and began a quiet prayer. He didn't distinguish between friend or foe, the island hadn't either. When he finished, he pressed his palm to the hot glass and whispered, "May the earth cool." In the command post below, maps were being redrawn. Peleliu was officially declared secure, but nobody celebrated. The colonel simply signed the report and said, "God help us if this is what victory looks like." For the Japanese survivors, hidden in the deeper tunnels that fire had missed, the end came in silence. Some died of thirst, others by choice. A few stumbled out days later, eyes glazed, hands raised to a sky that seemed too bright. One officer, barely alive, tried to explain to his captors. "We thought fire dies in stone," he said. But here, the stone burned. The Marines who heard him said nothing. There was no triumph left in them, only exhaustion, and the strange feeling that they had fought something beyond human. When the first rains came, the island steamed. Water hissed across coral slopes, turning to vapor before it touched the ground. The rain smelled like metal and oil. For hours, fog wrapped the island in white, and from out at sea it looked like Peleliu was still burning beneath the clouds. Weeks later, war photographers arrived. They expected scenes of heroism. What they found instead was silent landscapes of melted stone and black trees, like the aftermath of some biblical judgment. Their photos, when printed, stunned the world. One journalist wrote, "It is said that war changes men, but here, war changed the earth itself." Back in the States, the stories spread through whispers and headlines. The public read of an island so hot it boiled the sea at its edges, so scarred that nothing grew there for years. Mothers stared at grainy newspaper images of their sons standing among ruins that looked older than time. The caption under one photo simply read, "Peleliu, the night the world caught fire." For the Marines who lived it, that sentence felt too small. They remembered the smell of burning coral, the sound of fuel gurgling in the tanks, the glow that clung to their skin. They remembered looking at each other in the light of the flames and realizing that the line between survival and destruction had vanished. Phelps once told a war correspondent, "You don't aim a flamethrower, you release it, and once it's out, it doesn't belong to you anymore." Even the Japanese commanders who studied Peleliu after the war admitted it had changed everything. "We built for endurance," one wrote, "but endurance without adaptation is just waiting to die." Their fortress of coral had taught them that no wall, no design, could outlast innovation driven by desperation. Peleliu was supposed to be proof that Japan could hold forever. Instead, it became proof that forever was shorter than one night of fire. When the war finally ended, veterans of the battle carried pieces of the island home, chunks of black coral, bits of melted metal, souvenirs of a place that had tried to erase them and failed. Some kept them on shelves, others buried them in gardens, but all agreed on one thing: it wasn't the enemy they remembered most. It was the heat. Years later, when Marlowe was an old man, he was asked what Peleliu taught him. He looked at the reporter for a long time before answering. "That everything burns," he said. "Even the things that swear they can't." He paused, then smiled faintly. "And sometimes, that's how the light gets in." When the war finally ended, Peleliu was still smoking. Long after the battleships sailed away and the headlines faded, the island kept breathing heat from under its coral skin as if it remembered. For months, nothing grew there. The soil was poisoned by fuel, the coral blackened by soot. When rain fell, it steamed. Birds never returned. Locals who tried to fish near the shores said the sea smelled of iron. It wasn't just an island anymore, it was a scar. And like all scars, it had something to teach. Historians would later call Peleliu the forgotten inferno, but for the men who fought there, it could never be forgotten. Every marine who walked off that island carried its heat inside him. Some went home and never spoke of it again. Others woke in the middle of the night decades later, hearing the hiss of fire echoing through dreams. To the outside world, the flamethrower became a symbol of terror. To the Marines, it was something else entirely, a tool of survival. They didn't celebrate what it did, they respected what it cost. Every man who carried one knew the risk. The weapon didn't forgive mistakes. It demanded courage measured in seconds, the time it took to open a nozzle and light the night. In 1946, war photographers returned to Peleliu to document the island's recovery. They found caves sealed by glass, coral melted into smooth, mirror-like walls. In the sunlight, the surfaces gleamed silent monuments to a night when the world discovered what fire could do to stone. A Japanese historian visiting the island years later wrote, "Peleliu was not defeated by men or machines. It was defeated by transformation when the air itself became the enemy." For Japan, Peleliu was a revelation. The empire that once mocked fire as primitive now understood it as unstoppable. They studied its effects, not to glorify destruction, but to understand resilience. "We believed we could outlast anything," one surviving engineer said, "but you cannot outlast evolution." In America, the lessons took a different form. Military engineers studied flamethrower tactics to create safer, more controlled weapons, ones that could clear obstacles without consuming everything around them. Science turned horror into understanding. The war had shown that technology without restraint was a mirror too bright to look into for long. But for the men, the memories weren't technical, they were human. Marlowe, the flamethrower corporal, went home to Kansas and became a mechanic. He never built another weapon. He said the sound of welding torches reminded him of the roar. He kept one souvenir from Peleliu, a small, glassy piece of coral that had once been part of a cave wall. He'd set it on his workbench and call it the fire that lived. When journalists asked him decades later what he thought of the flamethrower, he answered softly, "It was never about burning the enemy. It was about reaching places no bullet could." Across the Pacific, on a rebuilt Japan, survivors of Peleliu visited a memorial stone erected at the base of the ridge once called Bloody Nose. The inscription was simple. Here fire met stone, and both remembered. Veterans from both sides would sometimes meet there in silence. They didn't speak the same language, but they shared the same look, the understanding that Peleliu had taken something from them both. By the 1960 seconds, as new wars began, the flamethrower disappeared from the battlefield. Technology moved on, but its ghost remained. It had shown mankind the edge of what fire could do, and that knowledge never left. Filmmakers tried to recreate Peleliu in documentaries, but no lens could capture its heat, no soundtrack its silence. Those who had seen it said the same thing. You had to feel the air on your face. Only then did you understand. In the 1980 seconds, when veterans of the 1st Marine Division returned for the last time, Peleliu had finally grown green again. The jungle had come back, roots curling through the cracks, covering the scars. But beneath that green, the ground was still warm, the soil still mixed with the ash of both armies. They stood quietly near the ridge, where fire had once poured from the earth. Some placed helmets on the ground, others whispered prayers, and as the wind moved through the new trees, it carried the faint smell of burnt coral, a reminder that even after 40 years, the island hadn't forgotten. For the world, Peleliu became a lesson in contradiction, that the same hands which build, destroy, the same fire that consumes, illuminates. It was proof that war doesn't just change maps, it changes matter. It reshapes what we believe can or cannot burn, and in that reshaping, mankind learned something terrifying and true. Fire doesn't only destroy the enemy, it reveals what was already fragile. Peleliu burned all night and long after the flames died. The memory kept glowing. In every generation that studied that battle, one truth remained. The island didn't burn because of hate. It burned because men refused to stop moving forward, no matter what stood in their way.